No, it is not. So, here's the. I can show you what I got. The Body Shop. It's a cumulative data.
Yep. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's information session hosted by CIET on behalf of the ISO Save on Energy Initiative. My name is Peter Lemoine, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we dive into the content, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, please ensure that your microphone is muted unless you're speaking. Second, the session is scheduled to last 1.5 hours. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation for any questions you may have, and we'll address questions that directly pertain to the slides being presented. Any other questions can be referred to the ISO at trainingandsupport@iso.ca. And we will also be using a Mentimeter to conduct a live survey with attendees to help inform the training. You can participate in the live survey by scanning a QR code or by opening menti.com and typing in the code 5683303, and I'll put that shortly into the chat. The slides used in today's presentation will also be shared with attendees after the session. And please note that the session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all participants afterwards for reference. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We have Emily Thorn-Corthe and Robert Story of Thorn Associates here to lead today's information session on carbon pricing. Thorn Associates is a reputable consulting firm known for its expertise in sustainable energy solutions and environmental consulting. They specialize in advising businesses and organizations on implementing sustainable practices, optimizing energy usage, and navigating regulatory frameworks related to environmental compliance. They are recognized for their comprehensive approach, blending technical expertise with strategic insights to help clients achieve their sustainability goals. Their team is comprised of seasoned professionals with backgrounds in engineering, environmental science, and policy. Thorn Associates works with clients across various sectors, from commercial to industrial and institutional entities. So with that, I welcome you, Emily and Bob, and I turn it over to you to take us through the session. Oh, Emily, you're on mute.
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and nice to virtually meet those of you who we don't know, and to see some familiar faces and names. So looking forward to talking to you today about carbon pricing. So just doing a check, Peter, you can see the information session objectives?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
So today we are going to go through what carbon pricing is and why it's needed. We'll talk about different types of carbon pricing, and we're going to start global and then go down diving into the Canadian federal carbon pricing system, and then diving further into Ontario's carbon pricing system. We'll then wrap up to discuss something called internal carbon pricing. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's related to putting in place a carbon price for your business, typically in jurisdictions where there is no carbon pricing. So we'll get into some more details on that. And we'll wrap up with some economic effects on industry, both positive and negative, sort of climate-related risks and opportunities related to carbon pricing. So before diving in further, we'd like to get to know a bit more just about the audience's understanding currently of carbon pricing. And just for your information, we do have in the audience a nice variety of different industrial sectors represented, including automotive, food, mining, pharmaceutical, paper, and hopefully you haven't missed any others, as well as utilities and consultants as well. So thank you all. And I'm going to turn it back over briefly to Peter, who's going to run the very first mentee question.
Yes, thank you, Emily. And I'm going to now share the Menti survey. And so you can join the survey by going to menti.com and entering the code 5683303, or you can scan the QR code that you see here. And I really encourage everyone to join, because the more information we get on attendees' experience and positions, the more we can respond and tailor things in the presentation. I'll just give it a few more minutes or a few more seconds before I go to the first question. Okay. So the first question is, what do you know about carbon pricing? And if you're just joining the meeting, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 5683303 to participate. So far, it's looking like a good majority of the attendees know the basics about carbon pricing. About half as many have heard the term but don't know much. There seems to be one expert on the field. We'll just give it a few more seconds. It looks like we've slowed down. Okay, Emily, it seems like a good 2/3 have know the basics about carbon pricing, and about 1/3 have heard the term but don't know much. So this is where we stand with the attendees on their knowledge about carbon pricing. Thank you for everyone who participated.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Peter. That's really helpful context, and thank you for everybody who participated. So I am going to share my screen again, and just double checking. Can you now see the what is carbon pricing?
So I can see.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So carbon pricing is a bit of a long definition, but basically it's an economic policy. It's an accounting strategy, and it's used to recognize and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by assigning a price to the emissions. And one thing to keep in mind is it's called carbon pricing, which might be slightly misleading because it's not only carbon dioxide pricing, but it's also the other greenhouse gases, which we'll see on the next slide actually are important to consider as well. So when we do talk about carbon pricing, one of the nuances for those who know the basics but may not know this nuance is it's not just related to carbon dioxide, but it's related to what's called carbon dioxide equivalent, which we'll get into more detail on how to calculate that, but essentially covers all of the 7 greenhouse gases. So pricing is typically the most economically efficient way to drive an outcome compared with regulations, for example. And we're not getting into any politics here today, but I would just like to point out that carbon pricing is a pro-market, sort of AKA typically conservative way of lowering greenhouse gases. So using prices is a basic mechanism of free markets. And therefore, economics does back up that carbon pricing is the most efficient tool to reduce greenhouse gases. There can be other tools like regulations that can be used as a complement for certain situations. The idea here is that the sort of pollution pays concept. So there is a cost to cleaning up air from the greenhouse gas emissions that organizations and individuals emit. There's also a cost to healthcare due to fossil fuel pollution, and that's currently, being borne by society and not by the organizations that are emitting it. So when there's a negative effect on others, it's generally accepted that the person or organization creating that negative effect would remedy them through paying. So putting a price on carbon dioxide and other equivalent greenhouse gases is, again, the widely recognized as the most efficient means to reduce emissions. So let's just discuss a bit of science. I promise you this is the only science-based slide in the whole presentation today. But for those, again, who know the basics and want to get a bit more in depth, when we talk about greenhouse gases, as I mentioned, there are 7 different greenhouse gases. So in addition to carbon dioxide, which is, by the way, the most kind of important because it's the most prevalent, but even though on a volume basis, like carbon dioxide is going to be emitted by far as the largest greenhouse gas being emitted, and it has a global warming potential of 1. That global warming potential is basically representative of how big an impact the gas has on an equivalent sort of volume basis. So you can see methane, which is natural gas, actually is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So wherever, again, organizations and companies can reduce natural gas usage, used for home heating, potentially even being flared in iron and steel, or leaks in oil and gas production, it's really important. And that's why you've seen sort of more focus on methane more recent in the recent years. I won't go through necessarily every single gas, but just for your information, you can see these global warming potentials increasing by orders of magnitude, right? So then we get to nitrous oxide, that's colloquially known as laughing gas. It has a 265 times the carbon dioxide. So very small amounts of nitrous oxide, again, are very potent greenhouse gases. These are typically used in the medical field for surgery and dentistry as anesthetics, but also in semiconductor manufacturing and food processing. I know we have some food processors perhaps who use nitrous oxide. Then we get to sulfur hexafluoride. So I know we have a number of people here from the utilities sector, and if you don't know, this is really important, the sulfur hexafluoride, or SF6, for you to know. You can see a very high global warming potential, 23,000, and it's used, 80% of this worldwide is used in electrical transmission and distribution, mainly in transformers. It's an excellent insulating gas. So making sure there's no leaks, or as few leaks as possible of SF6, is going to be really important in that field. It's also used as an etching gas in manufacturing of semiconductor devices, photovoltaic panels, and in the medical field. I'm not going to go through the nitrogen trifluoride and the hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons too much. They're used in much smaller quantities, but you can see they also have very significant global warming potentials. And when we talk about refrigerants with our clients, for example, we do lots of work across industry, especially in mining, but they're like, oh, we only use a few bottles of refrigerant per year. Can't we kind of ignore that? Won't that be immaterial? And I would strongly suggest that you do account in your greenhouse gas accounting. If you are not already, make sure that you're looking at the refrigerants you use, because they have very high global warming potential. So even with a small amount, it could be significant. So those are all inputs into the carbon pricing. Promise that's the end of the chemistry lesson for today. Okay, so why do we need carbon pricing? Well, we talked a little bit about that idea of sort of the polluter plays, and right now, when you don't, in jurisdictions with outside of Canada that do not have carbon pricing, essentially the greenhouse gas emissions are acting as an externality. An externality is basically when the actions of one economic agent, so pollution, affect another economic agent outside the market mechanism. So I know that's a bit of a technical definition, but essentially if you internalize externalities, so the externality being the greenhouse gas emission, it makes the emitters financially accountable for the negative externalities. So those negative externalities would be, for example, the cost to our healthcare system, the cost of cleaning up the air pollution, and the cost of extreme events becoming much more likely due to climate change. So the first reason here, internalizing externalities, is an example of carbon pricing. I'll give you another externality, for example, housework that is done by people at home or childcare that's unpaid. We're not going to go into the details. That's obviously outside the scope of today's version, but that just gives you an example of another externality that is not currently in our global economic model that really needs to be. So a second reason for carbon pricing is market efficiency. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, carbon pricing is the most efficient way to basically, by pricing carbon, get that, choices basically by consumers and organizations to change their behavior, right? So in terms of a market efficiency, it encourages more efficient resource allocation and promotes investment in low carbon technologies. We'll see that in the most of the Canadian programs, their carbon pricing programs, essentially the proceeds that the government collects from organizations or individuals, well, especially organizations, have to then, you can apply back for those proceeds that you submitted, but you have to use those proceeds for decarbonization activities. The third reason for carbon pricing is revenue generation, and this kind of ties into what I was just speaking about. So it can generate government revenue that can be then used to fund decarbonization projects and climate change mitigation. So if you have been paying as an organization into any carbon pricing system, so in Ontario, the emissions performance standard, or even previously in Ontario, we also had the output-based pricing system up until the end of 2021, there are still proceeds in those programs, and if you're not applying and getting those, then you definitely, that's a very large lost opportunity. So highly suggest that you do apply. It's essentially like guaranteed incentive funding. They're non-competitive. Well, at least the EPS is non-competitive, and so you definitely want to get your money back, essentially, and it'll help fund your decarbonization projects. And then lastly, the social cost of carbon. You might not be familiar with that term. What is a social cost of carbon? Well, it's a measure of the incremental additional damages that are expected from an increase in emissions of a given greenhouse gas. So again, those extreme weather events, healthcare impacts, those kind of things. And you can see here in 2024 for CO2 only, so not all the greenhouse gases, it was $266 per ton of carbon dioxide. So much higher. Right now, the price is $80. So that's like over 3 times the actual sort of carbon price when we take all of the society impacts. So I think that when people are saying, that we have a high price, you can see that the social is actually way below what the social cost really is. I just want to share a quick story about a side benefit of carbon pricing we had with a client. So one of our clients who's an energy manager, she was actually able to collaborate more closely with her with the finance department, and they needed, updated quarterly budget numbers. And since she was in charge of the carbon pricing, and thanks only really to the carbon pricing, the company was able to develop a more accurate cost model for forecasting their costs that was updated quarterly. Whereas if there had been no carbon pricing, then historically the energy manager would only maybe liaise with finance like to update once a year. So that was a benefit to the organization. I'm just going to pause now. Peter, are there any questions on sort of what is carbon pricing or why we need carbon pricing?
Yeah, Emily, I'm looking at the chat now, and we currently actually do not have any questions submitted by attendees, but if there's anyone who would like to submit a question now or throughout the presentation, please do. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation for questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so you don't need to wait. I'm happy to take questions throughout. I actually think that's more interactive and more interesting for you, and keeps everybody awake just versus me speaking the whole time. Okay, well, I will move ahead then, and we'll we'll pause for questions again in another couple slides. So what are the different forms of carbon pricing. So there are actually basically two types, a carbon tax and an emission trading system. So a carbon tax is essentially where you just have a price per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. In this case, your price is known. So example, again, in Canada in 2024, it's $80 Canadian per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, going up, by the way, to 170, rising by $15 per year. So $170 per ton CO2e by 2030. But what is uncertain is the amount of emissions that will actually be produced from this policy. In contrast, there's something called an emissions trading system. In the emission trading system, for example, we'll talk about cap and trade that they have in Quebec, is your emission reductions are known, but there's price uncertainty because there's actually, rather than having a fixed price as in the carbon tax, you have auctions on a market. So it's a market-based policy, and the carbon price can fluctuate fairly substantially. So in an emissions trading system, they're actually within that two types of emission trading systems. There's the cap and trade and baseline and credit. So cap and trade, as the name suggests, there's a cap, so a limit on the total amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that can be emitted for each emitter. So again, Quebec in Canada has a cap and trade, and also Ontario, actually, we have in the appendix, we have a history of the carbon pricing systems, and if you're confused about what's going on, it's very understandable because Ontario has actually gone through since 2017, which is not that long ago, whatever, 7 years, we've gone through 3 different carbon pricing regimes in Ontario. So we had the cap and trade in 2017 and 2018, and then we went to the federal output-based pricing system, and then in 2022, we moved to the emission performance standard. So cap and trade, there's also one in California, and Quebec's cap and trade system is linked with California. Ontario was also linked briefly. So again, it has that cap. And then what happens is the government will often give some free emission allowances to emission intensive trade exposed emitters, like for example, the steel industry. And if you are under your cap, you can sell your emission allowances to another emitter that is over their cap. And if you are over your cap, you can either purchase emission allowances from the auction, again, at sort of a volatile changing pricing, or you can also purchase it from other entities. Then the baseline and credit system is somewhat similar, but it's different in that there's no fixed cap on emissions, but you have an annual activity-based limit. So that's like an emissions intensity, and Ontario's emission performance standard and Alberta's technology innovation and emissions reduction tier regulation are example of provincial baseline and credit. So this, we'll get into more details for the Ontario system on this activity-based limit, but it's basically essentially, again, emissions intensive, so tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per liter of juice produced, for example. And you can earn credits if you're below your activity-based limits that you can sell to others who need them, for example. And it's called a baseline and credit because you have a baseline number that's your specific number. And over time, usually there's a stringency factor that makes it more difficult over time. And your baseline, your limit essentially goes, your activity-based limit goes down. It's not a fixed cap. Okay, we're going to go to Menti now. And Peter, if there are any questions, we can address those before the Menti, or otherwise we can jump into the second question for the Menti.
Yes, we do actually have a few questions that came in that we can talk about before the next Menti. The first one is from Gordon, and he asks, where can we find details on how the social cost of carbon is established?
Good question. We actually have some links. Give me a second here. Yeah, in the presentation, there's the social cost of carbon you can actually see is in green, and there's actually a link there from the Environment and Climate Change website. So once you get a copy of the presentation, you can click on that link, and otherwise I would suggest you just go to Environment and Climate Change Canada and search for social cost of carbon. You should get some good information there.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Gordon, for your question. We also have a question from Connor. And Connor asks, do you typically incorporate carbon tax and payback estimations for emission reductions projects? Is there a baseline price, or does it vary significantly depending on the size and location of the project?
Yes, great question. Absolutely. We incorporate a carbon tax for certainly any projects that are in Canada where there is, of course, well, carbon tax or like emission trading system. And so in terms of in jurisdictions where there is already a price, we 100% will evaluate that. For example, we're looking, it's a kind of exciting opportunity with one of our clients on renewable diesel, and the renewable diesel is slightly more expensive than the diesel alternative, but if you incorporate the carbon tax credits in this case that they will get, it actually becomes economically attractive, a positive return on investment. So they're getting both financially attractive, I guess, opportunity as well as decarbonization at the same time. Now, I guess we do work globally as well, and so if you do have facilities globally, then in that case we would typically do scenario analysis. So we would typically have a scenario with no carbon tax if that's the current state, but we would also tend to do a scenario where we would mimic in a carbon price. And in terms of to determine the amount of that carbon price, it's on a case-by-case basis, but some countries do have, plans. Some are in progress. We'll actually see on the next slide after the Menti globally the different jurisdictions. And once a jurisdiction has a program that's like under consideration, then they may already have some ideas of potential pricing that may be published, and otherwise you can look at similar jurisdictions, that kind of thing. But yeah, absolutely, we look at that. Did I answer all the points of that question, Peter, or is there anything missing?
No, that was quite a thorough response. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Connor, again for your question. And I think at this point we can go to the next question on the Menti.
Yep.
And so for those of you who have joined since the last Menti survey, you can join the training survey by going to menti.com and entering the code 5683303 as shown on the top of the screen here. And now I'm going to go to the next question. And the next question we have for you is, which carbon pricing mechanism is used more across jurisdictions? Carbon tax, emissions trading system, or a close call? Both are used significantly. Most people seem to think a carbon tax, followed by an emissions trading system. If you think it's a close call. A few answers still coming in. Well, it looks like, Emily, really a large majority of the attendees think that the carbon tax is the most commonly used mechanism.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my slide to actually reveal the answer in graphical format. So just see if you can you see on your screen the map there?
Yes.
Peter? Perfect. Yes. So actually, very few of you got this correct. So a good learning is it is actually too close to call, essentially. So there are 39 total carbon tax regimes in the world and 36 total emission trading systems. So very, very close. So this graph, the green is a little hard to read. Apologies, this is just how they did it. But essentially the most dark green that you see in Canada is where both have implemented. And I think we've mentioned that, or maybe not yet, but in different jurisdictions in Canada, there is a carbon tax and an ETS, one or the other or both. The little dots are like not a sub-national, so typically provincial or state-based systems. So then if you look at and it's hard to talk about these greens, but the green for carbon tax, you can see is basically in a number of countries, but not, again, about 39. So quite a few, but not that much more than the ETS. And then the lighter colors, sort of green and yellow, very light, those are under consideration, so or development. So they're not yet implemented, but are likely to be implemented. So some of the takeaways, first of all, Russia, most of Africa, and the US at a national level have no national carbon pricing mechanism. Although you can see the US does have some state-based carbon pricing in California. They also have in Washington and what's called RGGI, which is for the eastern provinces, but it's only the electricity generation sector. Another thing to note is in Europe, it's basically entirely covered. There's not a single country there. I don't think that is not part of some kind of carbon pricing. Europeans have mostly the emission trading system or both, not just a carbon tax, and that'll be relevant a little later. So now we're actually going to go back to Menti for 2 questions for some more sort of learning about emission trading systems and carbon taxes worldwide. Unless, Peter, is there any questions on this information?
We did have another question come in from Kashish. And the question is, do we have any specific instruments to measure greenhouse gases from industries, individuals, et cetera, on the basis of which carbon pricing draws, and do these specific entities get charged on the basis of this?
Yes, so absolutely. I mean, there are different measurement devices for the greenhouse gases that can be measured. I think it's much more common, at least again with our clients, that typically there's recognized greenhouse gas emissions per, like on the energy side. So there is a recognized, for example, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per liter of diesel and per liter of gasoline that is has been measured scientifically and is the same basically all the time. So most companies do not need to do those types of measurements, like in contrast, for example, to non-greenhouse gases like SO2 emissions out of a stack. It's kind of different with most greenhouse gases because of, again, the known nature. Usually your greenhouse gases, in terms of greenhouse gas counting, that's something that we do for companies, so we know this quite well. So usually in the industries we work in, like 80-90% plus of the emissions are going to be related to energy. So again, those you do not need to measure them because we know, you measure how much fuel you use, so how much diesel, gasoline, propane, how much electricity you consumed, and then there's grid emission factors for that. So I would say that yes, these industrial companies are absolutely calculating it, but usually you do not need to specifically measure, except in maybe some of the more sophisticated gases. I'm not so familiar with HFCs and the PFCs, the hydrofluorocarbons and the perfluorocarbons, and SF6. Though that's where maybe some more measurement might be required, especially for leaks, I would say, methane leaks as well. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Kashish, for your question. Emily, would you like to take some more? There's a couple more questions that came in, but would you like to take them before or after the Menti slides?
Yep, we can take them now. Sure, go ahead.
Let's do them now. Okay. Yep. We have a question from Mustafa. When comparing countries that use ETS to those that have implemented a carbon tax, is there any data indicating which approach has been more successful?
That is a fantastic question. I have not seen it. I'll open it up to my team. So either Bob, or I know that Sammy and Michael, team members of mine as well, are on the line. I'm guessing that we don't have an answer, although that's a great question. Maybe we should go off and do a bit more research. But yeah, Bob, Michael, or Sammy, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I haven't seen sort of a comprehensive comparison. Certainly, I think having a combination of both, like we're doing in Canada, is it's hard to imagine that anything would be sort of better than that and more effective. I think it's probably the best path, but There's certainly and we'll see, I think on one of the later slides, there's certainly a range in the pricing that's used in different countries. I mean, saying a country has pricing, it could be literally, a few pennies versus per ton, and you still say that you're pricing, right? So versus there's others that are in Europe that are much closer to the social cost of carbon, much higher than Canada. So I think that the amount, the pricing amounts are probably more of a factor than the system that's being used.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, to add to that, as Bob said, it can be in over $100 in Europe typically, versus I know recently like Argentina, Brazil, some of the South American countries, well, they kind of flip-flopped, I think, go in and out of, but they've had, $5, for example, in the at least in the past or in currently. And so, yeah, very much so. I would also say it kind of depends on your objective as a government as well, right? As I mentioned, do you want price certainty but emissions reduction uncertainty, or do you want the opposite, right? And so that'll kind of, I think, dictate which system you're trying to, satisfy the population and have a max ceiling on a price, or you really want to satisfy the Global Paris Accord and really be sure you're going to get an X emissions reduction. That would help inform the type. But okay, any other questions, Peter?
Yes, Emily, thanks for your response to that. And thanks again to Mustafa for your question. We have a question from Al. Can you elaborate on the status of any of the state mechanisms in the US? How far along in development or serious are these that, or how far along in development or how serious are the areas that currently don't have one? I think let's start with the first part of the question. Can you elaborate on the status of any of the US mechanisms?
Yeah, I know, as I mentioned, so in terms of status of in place currently and being in effect, as I mentioned, California, Washington, and RGGI. RGGI is RGGI, the Regional, I think it's Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it has many, many states. I'm not going to be able to name them all, but all across Pennsylvania and a whole bunch of other states on the east. So you can just go to search for RGGI to know that, and that's only the electricity sector though. So, a natural next step would be to broaden beyond the electricity sector, but I haven't heard if that's under development yet. And so that's, I think, the first question. And the second, for the other ones, I cannot give additional really information right now. Again, I'll maybe open up to my colleagues for any additional. What I would say is, and I'll talk a bit about this a bit later, is there's the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission climate disclosure rules that you may have heard of. They were published in, I believe it was March of this year, 2024. And then as per typical, what happens in the States, there's a lot of lawsuits. So then there was a bunch of lawsuits that happened against the Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, and so they stayed, which means the rules. So they paused the climate rules. So they are currently in pause. And no, the rules are not carbon pricing, but they are, related to your greenhouse gas emissions in the sense that if it's material, you have to disclose scope 1 and 2, not scope 3. You have to disclose the expenditure related to severe weather events that could be climate related, and those kind of things. So I'll turn it over again, Michael, Bob, Sammy. Any thoughts on other U.S. related, I guess, information on carbon pricing?
Yeah, so I just linked something in the chat that gives that sort of overview on a map of the US, and definitely at a federal level, there is no carbon pricing like in Canada. There's no federal backstop that everything has to abide by. And it is very regional and very sort of, the east and west coast of the states are essentially the ones looking at carbon pricing more seriously. And so, you can see in that link I shared that California, Washington State, part of cap and trade, and then those northeastern states are starting to look at the power sector, but definitely not universal. And sort of, I wouldn't say there's anything in the pipeline, at least to the public knowledge, about a federal carbon price in the US.
I guess I just, typically, a lot of this is, of course, driven by politics in terms of, it seems that if jurisdictions that have more, I guess, consistent political direction tend to be able to, one way or another, tend to go in one direction and kind of stay there, whether they're building on their existing system or continually resisting having a system. It's the jurisdictions that kind of switch back and forth where it's really hard to get any traction because the next regime either kind of throws everything out, starts over again, and obviously that's the U.S. is kind of coming to another decision point here shortly. If I think that pretty well applies even at the state level as well as federally.
One point I just sort of thought about that would influence it is the EU's has basically a system called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where they essentially put carbon price to kind of bring when they import goods into the EU. So that's going to kind of put almost like a shadow price of carbon on other countries, because all of their exporters into the EU are basically going to have to pay a carbon tax in essence. And so there's a bit of a, interesting time period where we're seeing some countries and I guess unions putting carbon taxes on others.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. Very relevant. Currently, it's only on a handful, I think 7 different commodities, like the highest emitters, like I think it's aluminum and steel and a few others in Europe, but it will be expanded to a much broader commodities over the next few years. And Europe is leading, of course, as they usually do in anything kind of green and climate. And so, as Michael said, any goods being exported into Europe, it's kind of will have that carbon tax. And so at Canada, that we already have a carbon tax, it'll be the difference between our price and the European price. So our exporters will have less of a tariff to sort of pay than, for example, US or other countries that do not have a carbon price.
Well, thank you, Emily, and everyone else at Thorne Associates for the very thorough response. I also pasted a link on the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM as it's called, into the chat. I think at this point we can go back to Menti.
Yes, and just as a reminder, Peter, there's actually 2 questions that will go back to back, and then I'll give the answers to both on the next slide.
Terrific. Okay, so for those of you who have joined since the last Menti slide, you can join the survey at menti.com and entering the code at the top. And I encourage everyone to join who has not thus yet joined the survey. And I will now go to the next question. The next question is, how much was total carbon revenue globally in 2023? Less than $1 billion US, between 1 and 20 billion US dollars, between 20 and 100 billion US dollars, or more than 100 billion US dollars. Okay, so increasingly, the crowd seems to think that the revenue is somewhere between 25 and 100 billion, with the next largest segment saying that it's more than 100 billion, and just a handful of people saying it's less, that it's 20 billion or less. Okay, so these are the responses to the first question. And the next question is coming up. And this question is, what was the revenue split between carbon taxes and emission trading schemes? Almost equal, carbon tax 30%, emission trading schemes 70%, carbon tax 70%, emission trading schemes 30%. Okay, there's a more distribution in this response than previous questions, about an equal number. Think that the revenues are about equal, or that carbon tax was 70%. a smaller number think that the carbon tax was 30% and the emissions trading revenues were 70%. So a little bit more of an even distribution in responses to previous questions. So thank you everyone who participated in these last two survey questions. And I'll turn it over to Emily, to you to discuss.
Perfect. Okay, so the big reveal here. Can you see the graph, Peter, of ETS versus carbon tax worldwide?
Bright and clear, yes.
Great. Okay, so the first thing, the question asked about 2023, and I do have some numbers, but I didn't have a nice graph. So this graph is 2022. You'll see it said 95 billion US dollars. So if you were answering for 2022 and you said under 100 billion, you would be right. But the question was actually for 2023, so it is over 100 billion is the answer. So you can see that these are large dollar figures that we're talking about. So over 100 billion worldwide US in 2023 is being collected and hopefully in most cases used for decarbonization in these pricing schemes. Another interesting thing, I think about a third of you got it right, is that the ETS is actually generating by far the most revenue. So as we saw previously, in terms of the sort of number of regimes globally, they were about equal in terms of relatively half and half split, but the revenue is mostly coming from the ETS. And I haven't seen the data why, but my personal thought is that because ETS is more prevalent in Europe, and Europe has among the highest carbon prices in the world, that's my theory, which I'm going to stick to, as to why the ETS revenues are much higher than the carbon tax revenues were. So hopefully you all learned something there in terms of the scale of the revenues and the different funds. Okay, so now we've spoken now in general and globally about carbon pricing. We're now going to go dive down it to the national Canadian level. So we're going to talk about the federal carbon pricing system. So there is a act called the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, and it was passed in 2018. And this basically establishes a set of minimum national standards for carbon pricing. And the goal of that is to help meet Canada's emission reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. So the Act has two carbon pricing mechanisms. It has what's called the federal fuel charge, and this is sort of colloquially or known in the media as the consumer carbon tax. We'll get into more details on that on the next slide. And then the second mechanism is called the output-based pricing system. That's sometimes referred to as industrial carbon pricing. It's not for consumers. And essentially, provinces and territories, which all 13 jurisdictions in Canada, have to essentially either use the federal system or have a specific subnational, so provincial or territorial system that the feds have approved and agreed is, notionally equivalent. So as I mentioned previously, the Ontario did have an OBPS up until the end of 2021, which is now, as of January 1st, 2022, been superseded by the Ontario Emissions Performance Standard System, which we'll get to in a few slides. Just by the way, we did do a training previously with SIET and on behalf of the ISO on energy and emissions regulations that covered both the federal and the Ontario provincial, and the slides can be found on the ISO website. Perhaps it might be possible, Peter, to put those links or Alyssa in the chat at some point. That would be great. And I'm not sure if they're already in place, but anyways, if they're not, at least have the link to where they will be. And while we are on this topic, we also did an incentive funding training that's also available on the ISO website or will be available soon. So I did just want to mention, again, we're not talking about politics, but in terms of, consumer carbon pricing, there are, potentially possibilities with the regime change that could be removed. But industrial carbon pricing looks likely to stay as per, for example, Alberta's premier supporting that, etc. I did want to also mention that these carbon pricing systems are typically focused just on your scope 1 direct emissions. So the scope 2 emissions, which are related to your electricity, are typically not reported through these programs. Because the electricity producers, the generators, that's their scope 1 emissions is to produce electricity. So for you in the industrial sector, you typically only report scope 1. But be careful, because we've had situations where clients give us, oh, this is our, carbon footprint, our greenhouse gas inventory, and we're like, whoa, well, where your entire scope 2 is missing, and it's because they never really calculated that because they didn't have to report it to the provincial system. But stakeholders, including investors, financing, consumers will all want to know also your scope 2 emissions. Absolutely. So even if you do not have to report them to the government, you absolutely do want to be reporting them, of course, in your sustainability report. Okay, so we'll go to the federal fuel charge, the first part of the federal carbon price mechanism. So this applies to 21 different fossil fuels, pretty much everything you can think of, at least me. So coal, coke, oil, gasoline, light fuel oil, aka diesel, natural gas, propane. And these charges are administered by the Canada Revenue Agency, and they are applied to fossil fuel producers and distributors. And then those fossil fuel producers and distributors, they pass them on to fuel consumers, such as, if you still have a gasoline car, then you would, go to the gasoline pump and have to pay those prices. If you're obviously an electric car, you don't have to. And so then again, those are set to increase $15 per year on every April 1st until 2030. So we can see here 2024 is the second bar. We're at $80 now and rising to $170 Canadian per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. One thing that's important to note is that 90% approximately of these fuel charges proceeds, so what the government has collected, do go back to individuals and families through the quarterly Canada Carbon Rebate, which was formerly known as the Climate Action Incentive Payment. So it is a program that's designed to be revenue neutral. It's trying to essentially get consumers to change their habits to choose less emissions intensive options. So, we chose to put in a heat pump, an electricity powered heat pump for our renovation, as opposed to, natural gas fueled heating, for example. That's the type of changes that the government is trying to encourage. And I'll just go through the fuel charge applied to common fuels. Again, you'll get a copy of this presentation so you can see this. It could be useful. So for example, if you go to the line of gasoline, you can see in 2024, it's adding about 17 cents. So it is material, approximately 10% of the cost is here in 2024, rising to 37 cents. So I'd like to give you an example of carbon price working is that renewable diesel example that I mentioned. So the client is not now on petroleum diesel, but because of carbon pricing working, even though renewable diesel is slightly more expensive, thanks to the carbon price, it actually makes the whole return on investment positive when you take into consideration the carbon price. So this can help them advance their decarbonization initiatives while looking at a positive return on investment. And you can also see at a diesel in 2024, about 21 cents per liter, and propane about 12 cents, natural gas about 15 cents per cubic meter. So that might be helpful to you to know for, doing cost benefit analysis in your organization, or if you are paying the federal fuel charge. So to be very clear, you have to know if you're in the emissions performance standard system in Ontario, you are exempt from the federal fuel charge. So be very careful about that. You do not get double counted. So it's only for smaller companies. 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, you do pay the federal fuel charge. So you would be paying this, or if you're in the optional 10 to 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and have not opted in to the EPS, then you would still pay the fuel charge. Okay, let's go into another Menti question, Peter.
Thank you, Emily. We actually had another question come in the meantime, if you'd like to address it first, or...
Sure. Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on time. I will. Yeah, we can address it. But
We
I'm
have
gonna
time for
probably,
one question?
Yeah, I think we
Okay.
have time for one. Yeah.
Just one. Okay. And this question comes from Paul. As a local distribution company in Ontario, we're regularly asked by our customers to assist in reporting on their CO2 per kilowatt hour. As we know, Ontario has relatively green supply of electricity. However, we have no means of knowing which generation source flows to their facility. Do you have thoughts on how we might respond to customers making these kinds of requests?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm trying to think because the ISO publishes at a provincial level which generators are being used, and I think even on a per hour basis. But to my knowledge, I don't know about like a location specific. Bob, did you have something to add? Or
Yeah, you're really, I mean, other than the data you can get from the ISO directly, their only alternative really is if you're going to go through, I'll just throw a name like Bullfrog or somebody like that who can guarantee low or zero emission electricity. Otherwise, it's whatever the ISO is publishing. It's all coming out of the same bucket. There isn't, and it does change obviously from hour to hour, day to day, based on the grid mix. Yeah, I don't think there's any other way to do it.
yeah,
I mean, there's
agreed.
there's average numbers, but day to day, and trying to match it up to your actual consumption. I mean, the pricing obviously is very easy to measure because that's the whole pricing systems, the hourly pricing and so forth, and the global adjustment. But yeah, the emission side is more averaged out, or yeah. I'm sorry, don't have any better answer than that.
Yeah, but I think you're right, Bob. It's not possible with the current data, unfortunately. I would suggest that if you and maybe got together with the LDC, what is it, Electricity Distributors Association, EDA, could maybe discuss with the ISO on sort of advocacy to see if the ISO might be able to develop that transparency. But yeah, again, currently that data does not exist at a more granular level to our knowledge, certainly not publicly available. And I'm pretty sure it does not exist. So yeah, unfortunately, I think they have to go with the provincial numbers for now, or power purchase agreement such as Bullfrog, as Bob mentioned, or through the Ontario Clean Energy Credits Program. We're going to be having a webinar, by the way, on that in the future coming weeks. So look out for that if that's something of interest. The Ontario Clean Energy Credits is related to getting basically emission-free electricity, like environmental attributes. So, okay, Peter, let's move just to the Menti in the interest of time.
Absolutely. Okay. And the next question is here. How many different carbon pricing systems exist in Canada across all the provinces?
Oh, and sorry, Peter, I meant to change. It's not just the provinces, it's territories as well. Apologies. It should be across all Canada. I should have changed
across
that.
all of Canada, across all
Yes.
provinces and territories.
Yes, thank you.
Around 5, most provinces have the federal system in place. Close to 10, the more the merrier, or around 15, we like diversity. Really, a large majority are saying around 5, most provinces have the federal system in place. Four think it's close to 10. One person thinks there's around 15. Okay, really, so a large majority think it's around 5.
Great. Okay. Well, in some ways, can you see the different systems here, Carmen, Peter?
Yes, I can see your slide. Yeah.
Okay, so it does depend somewhat on how you count. We actually internally had some discussions. I initially was going for 10, but my colleague convinced me that it should be 14, or, in the answer here, 15, approximately 15. And I'll go through why, but again, it's more of a counting exercise. So, but it is a lot, I guess, is the main message, is there's a lot. So first of all, There is, so the federal fuel charge would be, counted as one carbon pricing mechanism, and separately the federal output-based pricing system would be a second different type of carbon pricing system. So you have two there for Manitoba, Nunavut, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon. So they have those 4 provinces/territories have the same federal system, sometimes known as the backstop. So that gives you a count of 2. And then in the second column, in this case, all of these 6 provinces use the federal fuel charge, which we've already counted, so we don't count that, but they have separate independent provincial systems that are all slightly different for industry. So that sort of, you add another 6 different ones. So we're now at 8. And then if you move to the rightmost column, these 3 provinces/territories, so BC, Northwest Territories, and Quebec, they have both a sort of separate provincial fuel charge system and a separate provincial industrial system. So that actually is another 6, because 2 each that are different. So we had 8 before plus 6. That's how we get to 14. I mean, I think you could argue a few different ways, but it is more than 5, because yeah, they are certainly a lot of provincial systems that have been kind of quoted as equivalent to, or validated as equivalent to the provincial or the federal system, but they are different and they do have different nuances. It makes it a bit of a headache for consultants such as us, and I know there are a number of consultants on the line, because when you do work in each of the provinces, we do a fair amount of work in British Columbia, for example. They've just put in, as of I believe April 1st, a new output-based pricing system, but like a provincial one that does have some different nuances to the federal one, and so you just keep you on the toes. So I guess you do want to be careful that you have consultants who they know what they're doing to make sure that they're appropriately applying the right provincial system where necessary. Okay, so we've now covered the federal carbon pricing, and we're going to dive down into Ontario. I guess just before I do that, Peter, were there any final questions related to sort of federal carbon pricing before we dive into Ontario?
No, I don't see any other questions on that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I've mentioned the EPS emissions performance standard before. It is Ontario Regulation 241 that did come into effect, again, January 1st, 2022. If you don't know too much about that, again, would direct you to our previous webinar on the energy and emissions regulations. It is managed by the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, MECP, and it is mandatory for facilities over 50,000 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. If you are in the optional range, so between 10 and 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and you have not done the math to figure out if it is financially attractive to you to join the EPS, I would very, very strongly recommend that you do so, because as I previously mentioned, if you jump to this bullet at the bottom that's bolded, facilities enrolled in the EPS are exempted from the federal fuel charges. You get that back to you. And so therefore, it can be quite lucrative, because if you think about it, the federal fuel charge, you just have to pay. Do you get any money back to decarbonize? No. But in the EPS system, yes, you have to pay in, but then you get basically eligible to get exactly the same amount you paid in. You just have to use it to decarbonize. But if you want to decarbonize anyway, then you have this wonderful decarbonization budget that has been now, essentially provided to you. So the emissions performance standard is actually potentially a very excellent and attractive program compared to just sort of paying the federal fuel charge. In terms of quantification of for the greenhouse gas accounting, it does use the OREG 390, which has a long name, GHG, whatever, accounting and reporting and all this stuff. I can never remember the name, but it's quite a long name, but essentially it's your GHG accounting regulation. Again, we also covered that in the previous training. To determine your scope 1 facility emissions, again, which is what needs to be reported here, and from the use of fuels subject to fuel charge as well as biomass. Fuels, your scope 2 emissions, again, are not included, as these are emissions that are captured in the scope 1 emissions of electricity generators. Just some other points. There are some special rules that apply for new or expanded facilities that are expected to reach over 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So if you have a large expansion and maybe we're under the 10,000 and you think you might go over, or you're planning to build a new facility, then you definitely should look into those rules. There are currently approximately 100 facilities in Ontario that currently report over 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that just gives you an idea, and approximately 200 facilities that in Ontario that report between 10 and 50,000. But the vast majority of Ontario facilities are not eligible because they're not large enough emitters for the EPS. And so again, you have to pay those for your carbon emissions via the federal fuel charge in that case. There is one thing to note. There's another sort of benefit of the EPS is that there's a 9-month delay. So the payment price is the same as the federal carbon price, but there is this 9-month delay. So for example, the federal comes in on April 1st, as I mentioned. So, and the Ontario EPS on the following January 1st. So, on April 1st, 2024, it's $80 per ton carbon dioxide equivalent for the federal fuel charge, but only $65 per ton CO2e now for the Ontario excess emission units that will then rise to $80 per ton CO2e in January 1st, 2025. So you do kind of get that 9-month lower pricing. Okay, I think I'm going to just cover the EPS and then we'll take questions in a couple slides on anything related to that. So recall that the EPS is a baseline and credit type of emission trading system. So the baseline is your activity-based baseline emissions intensity. So for example, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of steel produced. Now there is something called your TAEL, total annual emissions limit. And this basically, there's the formula there we'll get to in a second, but it's related to your emissions intensity. So if you're above the TAEL, you have to pay, and if you're below it, you can sell credits to other emitters and generate revenue. So there is a whole methodology. By the way, this methodology for determining your total annual emission limit was updated in March of this year. So hopefully you already know that and have already been reporting that. In the case that you somehow were not aware of that, it is very important. The government wants you to report against that March standard. The calculation for your total annual emissions limit is effectively, there's some nuances, but your emissions intensity times your production times your stringency factor. So the stringency factor is essentially a percentage lower than 1 that goes down every year. So from like 1 to 0.88 to 0.86, etc. That essentially, will ratchet down whatever, approximately, I think it's 2%, I can't remember exactly, but per year to make it essentially, a continuous improvement process and more difficult. You can't just stay the same all the way out to 2030. You're going to be, if you stay the same, you're going to be paying more or getting less credits due to this stringency factor. And there are specific rules for sectors such as, steelmaking, petroleum, cement, mining, chemicals, electricity generation, and thermal energy. So you do want to read related to your specific sector. This is not, remember, an emissions cap because it's a baseline and credit type. It's based on emissions intensity, so per your production. So AKA, again, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per production basis. And again, this is Ontario's industry-based carbon pricing. So when we talk about consumer versus industry, this is the industry one, and that fuel charge that Ontario uses, the federal fuel charge, is the consumer one. And the baseline emissions intensity does depend on each industry and subsector. So you could have, for example, tons of CO2 equivalent per gigawatt hour of electricity generated, or for gigajoule of thermal energy, or you could have, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton processed or produced for chemicals, for example. Okay, and last slide just about the EPS is just talking about, so again, if you emit more than your TAEL, then you have a compliance obligation that you have to pay. If you emit fewer, then you get what are called emission performance units. And a really, really important point here bolded is you only pay for excess emissions over your limit of your TAEL. So you get a free pass entirely for all, emissions under your TAEL. So keep that in mind, and for all of your costing and cost benefit analysis of decarb projects, etc. You're also only going to save like when you can so you need to keep that into account. Okay, so I think you can also bank your credits for future years, and because the price is increasing over the years, it's going to be worth more. So that might be something to keep in mind. Peter, I'll pause here if there are any questions on the Ontario Emission Performance Standard.
Yes, we have a question from Al. How does a company receive the credit from optionally taking part in the EPS? Do they get a check or a tax reduction?
Yes, maybe I'm going to ask Bob or Michael to jump in there on that, the sort of physical, practical mechanism of how that credit occurs.
There is no rebate. The credits are basically banked, and they're not, or then and then can then be. And I don't know exactly how mature or organized the secondary market is. I think it's still in the early stages, but the credits are banked, so you do not get any kind of rebate. But you do have essentially a credit that you can sell or keep for your own purposes if you need them for future reporting periods.
Thank you, Bob. Okay.
Thanks to both of you for your responses. We have one more question. Do you want to take one more before we go on?
Sure.
Okay. Now, this is a fairly specific question, but are high emitting wastewater treatment plants subject to TAL and stringency factors?
So, Bob, again, you can add in any details. I believe wastewater, I'm not actually sure if they are one of the industries that are covered. The key thing would be they have to be at 10,000 TCO2e or more, and then you can opt in. I'm assuming they're not going to be at 50,000 or more. So we'll assume if they're under that, they cannot go in. And Bob, do you happen to know if they are one of the sectors?
They are. There were a number of them listed in the. So there is a list online of the participants. There are, as I recall, there was more than one. There were several, I believe, in Ontario that were both over 50,000 and between 10 and 50,000. I think there might have only been one or two that are over 50, but there are a couple of very large ones in the province. And I guess for the calculation, I don't recall what categories they would fall into exactly, but for the calculations, there's several different methods that you can use. In some cases, if your industry, in some industries, you have to use a particular method, and other ones you've got some options. If you don't want to use the kind of standard industry method, you can use a customized method. If you've got something that's, there might be some advantage to doing that, but for electrical generation, and I would think, I don't recall if wastewater treatment had its own category for the calculation process, but certainly on the emission side, there are at least half a dozen or so that were large enough to be in the program.
Okay, thank you, Emily and Bob. And those are the only two questions that have come in.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so we're getting into the wrap up few slides here. So we'll talk about how carbon pricing impacts Ontario industry. So first of all, just to give you an order of magnitude, we talked about, over $100 billion globally. Well, in Ontario, I don't know the total amount, but just from our experience with many of the larger industrial clients in the province, these payments or credits are already or will likely become millions of dollars each year per participant. So I mean, if you're on the smaller end, it'll be potentially less and only, a few hundreds of thousands, but there are definitely clients, many of them that industrial participants that are in the millions of dollars per year. So a great, opportunity or penalty depending on how your situation. And the emissions performance program, so different than the emissions performance standard, this is the proceeds basically program. So it used to be in sort of draft, it was called the emissions proceeds program. So if you see reference to that, that's the same thing. This is the new name, emissions performance program. And it was launched just at the end of June this year. And basically it returns those emissions performance standard payments to participants via funding. So again, for either capital-based decarbonization projects or study-based. So if you do have studies that you want to get done, this is a great way that you can pay for it. It is non-competitive funding, so you are notionally, able to receive the same amount that you paid in. And again, it's funded by your compliance payments collected through the EPS. One thing to note is, if you got credits and you did not pay anything, you cannot participate in this, performance program because you didn't pay anything. So it's meant to be, given back for the money you did pay. So, and electricity generators are also not eligible for this program. There is a separate program that we're not going to get into in this training. So some examples of eligible projects include stationary equipment retrofits for energy efficiency and fuel switching, or mobile equipment retrofits, building envelope upgrades, heat recovery, industrial process changes, carbon capture and storage, and then clean electricity and low carbon fuel production for your own use. So not, for others to be sold, but if you do want to put in some kind of clean electricity or low carbon fuel production for your own use, that is eligible. So you can look for more details on the Ontario MECP, Ministry of Environment, Climate Conservation and Parks website on the EPP performance program. And then just to wrap up on the EPS, this is a sample, but this is completely fictitious, to be very clear. So we've just, created this fictitious facility that produces 1 million tons per year of some product. And we just said that they have a baseline emissions of 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. But we wanted to show you the numbers of it with sort of an example. So typically the EPS system does use a 2015 to 2017 baseline. Obviously, if your facility did not exist then, they'll be using a more recent one. But for sort of old, facilities that have existed for a long time, that's typically what they have done. And then you can see the numbers in 2024. So we have the stringency factor, first of all, in 2024 is 0.886. So what that means is that compared to your baseline emissions intensity, or sort of I should say the total annual emissions limit is now being scaled essentially. So if it was 100,000, it would now be only 88,600, meaning that, again, you have to improve over time. And you can see that drop by, as I mentioned, approximately 2%, not exactly, each year between now and 2030. You can see the emissions price. Again, that $65 is not a typo. That is correct, again, because of that sort of 9-month delay compared to the federal fuel charge price. So if you do nothing, then in this fictitious case, you'd have to pay $750,000. We've also created 4 scenarios. So in the first 3 scenarios, if you were, they assume you do nothing to reduce greenhouse gases between 2018 and 2022. And then they assume you start an annual improvement starting in 2022, but it kind of means you're already behind the game because the EPS system is assuming that you've been doing something since 2018, even though there was kind of no program and that kind of thing. Well, there was actually a federal program at that point, but so you're already kind of behind the game if you did nothing. So scenario 1 is a 1% reduction annually starting in 2022. Scenario 2 is a 2% annual reduction, again, starting only in 2022. Scenario 3 is a 5% reduction starting in 2022. And then scenario 4 is a bit different. We wanted to kind of see what if in scenario 4, it assumes that you improved sometime collectively, like as a total between 2018 and 2022, you had an 8% improvement from the baseline. So this is assuming you actually did do something, you know, between 2018 and 2022, and then you only did a 2% improvement going forward from 2022. So in this case, you can see you're in the red by a fair amount in scenario 1 and 2 with only a 1 or 2% reduction. You're actually making some money with a 5% reduction. And then if you actually did something in those years, 2018 to 2022, and didn't kind of get behind, and then you only do 2%, you're about even. So, you know, you can look at these numbers and see, but other takeaways are, you know, by 2030, if you do nothing, you could be in this, you know, fictitious example, but you could check for yourself, you know, how you kind of compare. If you're 100,000 is quite a lot. It was just easy for math, but, you know, $3 million potentially. So that's just an example. So now we're going to wrap up by talking about internal carbon pricing and the impacts in terms of opportunities and risks of carbon pricing on business. But before that, we'll go to our very last mentee, Peter, please.
Sure. Let me share the Menti survey and let's go to the final question. The final question is, does your facility participate in Ontario's emission performance standard OREG 241/19? Yes, no, or don't know. It's looking like most people don't know, Emily. Whereas 3 do and 3 say that they don't. Yeah, so 12 say that they don't know and 3 say that they do and 4 no. So a large majority aren't sure.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Peter. Yeah, so that's interesting. I'm hoping someone in your organization does know, but you know, if you're the person responsible for this, again, and you're in between 10 and 50,000 tons of CO2e for your organization as an industrial company, then I think you definitely want to see if there might be an opportunity there and do the financial analysis. Okay, so up until now, we've talked about carbon pricing implemented by governments at the national or subnational level. There is another type of carbon pricing that's used by organizations, so not governments, typically in jurisdictions with no or very low government imposed carbon pricing. And this is called internal carbon pricing when applied within an organization. So again, not within a country, nor a subnational state, nor a provincial level. Just checking, Peter, you see the internal carbon pricing screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so why would you put in an internal carbon pricing? Well, it can help you in your investment decision making. So if you're considering putting in electric vehicles for your mobile equipment versus gasoline or diesel vehicles, then if you incorporate carbon pricing, that can help change the economics of that. And even if it's not an actual fact, maybe if you're purchasing equipment or like even a natural gas furnace versus maybe an electricity fueled furnace, or putting in that heat recovery equipment on your furnace might make the economics more attractive, because you could say, hey, this equipment might have a lifetime of like 20 years. Well, it's highly likely perhaps that in the jurisdiction you are in, it might have a carbon pricing, be put in 5 years. Well, then you want to put in this internal carbon pricing. So again, this would typically not be for your Canadian-based assets, because there is already, the sort of price certainty related to at least the federal fuel charge, like carbon tax. There's also, understanding of the price for the output-based pricing system, or Ontario's emissions performance standard. So just to keep in mind, this would be for those of you who have other facilities outside of Canada, which I think potentially many of you do. So there is 3 main types. Internal carbon fee. This is about 15%, according to CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. They found about 15% of internal carbon price users use the internal carbon fee. This is kind of like an intra-company transfer pricing, like so you could apply it to a business unit level or certain high emissions activities, and you set a dollar value that is then used as a dedicated revenue or investment stream to fund decarbonization, essentially. So you're almost acting like the government in a way. And Microsoft and Ben & Jerry's ice cream, they use the carbon fees, internal carbon fee model. Microsoft revenues, they fund renewable energy and behavioral change projects, for example. And then the shadow price is the most common. So if you hear internal carbon price, by default, most people are talking about a shadow price. And that's basically, so no money is actually exchanged in a shadow price. There's no like fee or like fund, but it's just, as the name shadow implies, it's kind of used in basically spreadsheets to do calculations for investment decisions. And again, so that example I used of, decarbon equipment, of heavy emitting like fossil fuel based equipment versus clean electricity equipment, that could help in the cost benefit analysis and for sort of long-term business planning and investment strategy. So it's a fictitious price that you set based on what internally you think makes the most sense for your jurisdiction. It's not actually incurred, but it is easy to implement, and it does not affect your financial statements. And then the implicit carbon price is actually like, you can only calculate it historically. It's a retrospective calculation of how much the company is actually spending on decarbonizing, like on reducing emissions, as well as regulatory compliance costs and credits related to carbon. So, if you, for example, spent $1 million, which would be a lot, but let's just say for argument's sake, $1 million on decarbonization last year, and you saved, 1 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, your equivalent price would be $1 per TCO2e, for example. So that's kind of looked at retroactively, and it does affect your financial statements in terms of profit and loss because there's like real dollars there, right? Okay, and just very briefly, we don't have a lot of time, but I did just want to very briefly talk about disclosure. There is the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards that are in draft that are supposed to be released for final version this fall. And you do have to disclose if you have an internal carbon price, and if you do have one, disclose its price. So that is something to note. Also, again, the Europeans are leading in the European sustainability reporting standards, which are in force. You must disclose if you are in a jurisdiction that has carbon pricing. So this is the government carbon pricing in place, i.e. that are regulated under an emission trading scheme for Scope 1, for example. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and lastly here, potential impacts of carbon pricing on business. So there's both opportunities and risks. So from an opportunity perspective, you can leverage carbon payment proceeds, again, like from the Emission Performance Program, to improve productivity and improve your competitiveness while decarbonizing and also enhancing your resiliency. Financial risk, it could also be an opportunity, actually, like profitability could be less or more, if you're getting carbon credits because you're doing better than your peers in a sort of emissions intensity industry-based sort of system, then that can improve your profitability. It can also decrease it. Regulatory risk, there are stricter regulations around ESG, meaning environmental, social, governance, measurement, reporting, and decarbonization. That does take time and can lead you to have some risk. There's operational, again, risks or opportunities similar to financial. You can have either higher or lower operating costs. Decarbonization typically can lower your operation costs, but it could be higher capital costs for some of the equipment. From a legal perspective, if a business does not disclose that it's in a jurisdiction with carbon pricing, for example, Canada, and the carbon pricing has a material effect on its business, investors could potentially launch lawsuits saying that material issues related to climate were not disclosed. And again, that is a legal requirement in the European Union, but I think you could argue that in Canada, even though it's not explicit in our Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And market risks, if your business is more carbon intensive, customers could leave and go to your lower carbon intensive competitors. We are seeing this with Scope 3, which is the value chain emissions, in our supplier outreach and changing suppliers. Okay, so to wrap up and summarize, we have more than a dozen pricing systems in Canada. We sort of counted 14. There are those two types of carbon pricing instruments, taxes and emission trading systems, and there are different jurisdictions with different systems in place based on their own economic and political needs. Just FYI, in the appendix, which you'll get the slides, there are acronyms. There is a bit more details on the output-based pricing system, as well as history of the ETS system in Ontario, some more information about the EPS, carbon pricing and carbon credits versus carbon offsets. And there is going to be a carbon pricing fact sheet that we've created for you, available soon on the ISO website. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter, to wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Emily. We just invite you to also stay connected with tools and resources from the ISO, and to especially check out upcoming trainings on the Save on Energy website, which I've now posted in the chat. And we can advance to the next slide, Emily. Thank you. And one more thing that I would just like to highlight for people is that the Save on Energy 2024 Energy Management Excellence Awards are coming up, and you can sign up for that. I'll also put that invitation in the chat. And with that, so we wrap it up today. Thanks again to our presenters, Emily and Bob and Thorne Associates, and to all of the attendees, and especially for your great questions.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for hosting.
Thank
and
you.
To the CIET and to the ISO and to my team.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.